At 02:15 hours on November the 30th, 1942, the SG radar aboard USS Fletcher detected multiple contacts at 23,000 yards through impenetrable darkness off Tassafaronga Point. Commander William Cole, commanding Destroyer Division 12 from Fletcher's Bridge, had been tracking these ships for 6 minutes. The Japanese had no idea 5 American destroyers were positioned across their supply route. They had no radar capable of detecting the American force waiting in complete darkness off Guadalcanal's northwest coast. In 42 minutes, 8 Japanese destroyers would be sinking or crippled, and the Imperial Japanese Navy would lose a battle they thought they had already won, but the Americans would pay a price that no one expected. 4 heavy cruisers would be torpedoed, over 400 American sailors would die, and the United States Navy would learn that radar could help you see the enemy, but it couldn't prevent disaster if doctrine failed to match technology. The Japanese force consisted of 8 destroyers, commanded by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka from destroyer Naganami. His mission was to deliver 1,500 drums of supplies to starving Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. Each destroyer carried 200 drums lashed to their decks. The drums contained rice, ammunition, and medical supplies. The plan was simple: race down the slot at 30 knots, arrive off Tassafaronga Point after midnight, dump the drums overboard with lines attached to shore, withdraw before American aircraft could attack at dawn. Tanaka had executed this exact mission 11 times in the previous 2 months. He called it the Rat Run. American forces called it the Tokyo Express. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Tanaka was the most experienced destroyer squadron commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had fought at Midway in June. He commanded Japanese destroyers during the evacuation of Kiska in the Aleutians. He understood destroyer tactics better than almost any officer in either navy. His force that night included some of the finest destroyers Japan had built: Naganami, Takanami, Makinami, Kuroshio, Oyashio, Kagero, Suzukaze, and Kawakaze. All were Kagero-class or Yugumo-class destroyers, fast ships capable of 35 knots with powerful armament. Each carried 6 5-inch guns and 8 Type 93 torpedoes. The American force consisted of 5 destroyers and 4 heavy cruisers. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright commanded Task Force 67 from heavy cruiser Minneapolis. Wright had received command of the task force only 48 hours earlier. He had never commanded a surface action force in combat. He had never fought a night engagement. He had been assigned to the task force because he was the senior officer available when intelligence indicated another Tokyo Express run was scheduled for November 30th. Wright's cruisers were Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton. His destroyers were Fletcher, Perkins, Maury, Drayton, and Lamson. All 9 ships carried SG surface search radar. The technology had been proven effective at the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal 2 weeks earlier, when USS Washington used radar to destroy Japanese battleship Kirishima in 7 minutes. Wright knew about Washington's victory. He knew radar worked, but Wright did not understand how to use radar to control a night surface action. The difference between having radar and knowing how to fight with it would become catastrophically clear. Commander William Cole, aboard Fletcher, understood radar better than Admiral Wright did. Cole had trained his destroyer division extensively in radar-directed operations. He had studied the action reports from earlier engagements. He knew that radar allowed American ships to detect Japanese forces before Japanese lookouts could see American ships. He knew that radar provided accurate range and bearing data for torpedo attacks. He understood that the key to winning night battles was using radar to launch torpedoes silently from beyond visual range, then withdrawing before the enemy could respond with their superior long-lance torpedoes. Cole had briefed Admiral Wright on these tactics during the planning conference on November 29th. Cole recommended that the destroyers be positioned ahead of the cruisers with freedom to attack independently using radar. Launch torpedoes at maximum effective range, approximately 10,000 yards. Do not wait for cruiser gunfire. Strike first with torpedoes while invisible. Cole's recommendations were based on tactics developed by Commander Arleigh Burke and validated by recent American successes. Wright rejected Cole's advice. Wright ordered the destroyers to stay in column ahead of the cruisers, but not to launch torpedoes, without his explicit permission. Wright wanted to control the entire engagement from Minneapolis. He would decide when to fire torpedoes. He would decide when to open gunfire. The destroyers would follow his orders. This decision reflected traditional doctrine where destroyers operated as escorts to cruisers. The cruisers provided firepower. The destroyers screened against enemy destroyers and submarines. Destroyers did not operate independently. Wright's decision ignored everything that radar had revealed about night combat. Radar gave destroyers the ability to detect and attack independently. Centralizing control in a cruiser flagship meant information had to flow from destroyers to flagship, decisions made, then orders sent back to destroyers. The delay could be fatal in a fast-moving night engagement where seconds mattered, but Wright was the admiral. Cole was a commander. The organizational hierarchy was clear. Wright commanded. Cole obeyed. Task Force 67 departed Espiritu Santo on November the 29th and steamed north toward Guadalcanal. The ships arrived off Lunga Point on the evening of November 30th. Wright positioned his force to intercept Japanese ships approaching from the northwest. The destroyers formed a column 2,500 yards ahead of the cruisers. Fletcher led, followed by Perkins, Maury, Drayton, and Lamson. The cruisers followed in column. Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton. The night was dark with scattered rain squalls. Visibility varied from 500 yards in the squalls to perhaps 2,000 yards in clear areas. The sea was calm. Light wind from the southeast. Temperature was about 85 degrees. The tactical situation was ideal for radar, terrible for visual lookouts. At 2100 hours, Wright's force began patrolling back and forth along the northwest coast of Guadalcanal. The ships steamed east toward Cape Esperance, then reversed course west toward Tassafaronga Point. The pattern would continue until Japanese ships were detected or until dawn forced withdrawal. Everyone expected contact. Intelligence had been clear that a Tokyo Express run was scheduled for this night. Fletcher's SG radar swept continuously. The radar operators watched their scopes carefully. The circular display showed Guadalcanal's coastline clearly to the south, open water to the north and west. At 2300 hours, Fletcher's radar detected multiple contacts bearing 295 degrees, range 23,000 yards. The contacts were northwest of Cape Esperance, exactly where Japanese forces would approach if they were coming down the slot. Commander Cole ordered Fletcher's Combat Information Center to track the contacts. The CIC personnel plotted the contacts on the Dead Reckoning Tracer, a large plotting table that showed the tactical situation. The contacts were moving southeast at approximately 30 knots, 8 separate returns, a destroyer force. Cole immediately recognized this as the Tokyo Express. He reported the contact to Admiral Wright on Minneapolis. Wright received Cole's report at 2306 hours. Wright ordered the task force to increase speed to 20 knots and turn toward the contacts. The American formation swung northwest to intercept. The range decreased steadily. 20,000 yards, 18,000, 15,000. The Japanese showed no indication they knew American ships were present. At 23:15 hours, range had decreased to 14,000 yards. Cole requested permission to launch torpedoes. His destroyers were in perfect position. The Japanese were approaching on a steady course. The range was ideal for torpedo attack. Cole's destroyers could fire, then withdraw behind the cruisers. The torpedoes would hit before the Japanese realized they were under attack. Wright denied the request. He wanted to close to 10,000 yards before launching torpedoes. Wright was thinking in terms of visual range combat where 10,000 yards was considered maximum effective torpedo range. He did not understand that radar allowed accurate torpedo launches from much greater ranges. The Japanese would not detect American ships until visual range, perhaps 5,000 yards. In these conditions, American destroyers could launch torpedoes at 12 or 14,000 yards and be invisible when the torpedoes hit. Cole protested. He explained that closing further would bring American ships into range of Japanese torpedoes. The Type 93 Long Lance could reach 22,000 yards. If Japanese ships detected the American force and launched torpedoes, the results could be catastrophic. Wright overruled Cole's objections. The formation continued closing. At 23:20 hours, range was 12,000 yards. Cole again requested permission to fire. Again, Wright denied permission. Wait until 10,000 yards. Cole watched his radar scope with growing frustration. Every second brought his ships closer to danger. The Japanese formation was clearly visible on radar. 8 ships in column formation, heading directly toward Task Force 67. The tactical situation was perfect for an ambush. But Wright would not authorize the attack. At 23:23 hours, range reached 10,000 yards. Cole immediately requested permission to launch torpedoes. This time, Wright approved. Cole ordered his 5 destroyers to fire. But precious time had been lost. The Japanese were now close enough that their lookouts might spot muzzle flashes or torpedo launches. The advantage of surprise was diminishing with every passing second. Fletcher fired 10 Mark 15 torpedoes at 23:24 hours. Perkins fired 8, Maury fired 10, Drayton fired 8, Lamson fired 4. A total of 40 torpedoes entered the water in approximately 90 seconds. The destroyers immediately turned hard to starboard and increased to flank speed, withdrawing behind the cruiser column as planned. The torpedoes ran toward the Japanese formation at 46 knots. Time to impact was approximately 4.5 minutes at current range. The Japanese had no warning. Their lookouts saw nothing. Their ships had no radar to detect the American force. The first indication Admiral Tanaka had of danger was at 23:27 hours, when a lookout on Naganami reported seeing wakes approaching from the southeast. Tanaka immediately ordered emergency maneuvers. All ships, turn hard to port, increased to maximum speed. The Japanese destroyers began turning frantically, but 40 torpedoes were already in the water, spreading across their formation. Tanaka's quick reaction saved most of his ships. 7 destroyers completed their emergency turns and avoided the torpedoes, but destroyer Takanami, second in the Japanese column, could not turn quickly enough. 3 torpedoes slammed into Takanami almost simultaneously. The explosions were devastating. The destroyer's hull was torn open from bow to stern. Secondary explosions indicated magazines detonating. Takanami broke in half and sank within 4 minutes. Over 200 men died. There was no time to abandon ship properly. Men went into the water as the ship disintegrated around them. Admiral Wright observed the explosions from Minneapolis. He assumed the torpedo attack had been successful and that multiple Japanese ships were sinking. He ordered his cruisers to open gunfire at 23:30 hours. The 4 heavy cruisers illuminated targets with searchlights and began firing their 8-inch main batteries. The searchlights revealed the Japanese destroyers clearly. The cruisers concentrated fire on the nearest targets. Shells began hitting immediately. Destroyer Oyashio took multiple 8-inch hits. Fires started on her superstructure. Her forward gun mounts were knocked out. Destroyer Kuroshio was also hit. 1 shell penetrated her forward magazine, causing a massive explosion. She sank within 10 minutes. But the searchlights and gunfire revealed American positions to the Japanese. Admiral Tanaka now knew exactly where Task Force 67 was located. He knew the range. He knew the bearing. And his 7 surviving destroyers each carried 8 Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes. Tanaka ordered all ships to launch torpedoes immediately at the American cruiser column. 56 torpedoes entered the water between 23:31 and 23:33 hours. The Japanese aimed at the gun flashes and searchlight beams. They could see the American cruisers perfectly silhouetted by their own weapons. The torpedoes ran toward the American formation at 48 knots, leaving almost no visible wake. The American cruisers had no warning. Their radar could not detect torpedoes. Their lookouts could not see the torpedo wakes in darkness. The cruisers continued firing at the Japanese destroyers, completely unaware that dozens of torpedoes were approaching. At 23:37 hours, the torpedoes began hitting. Minneapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes on her port bow. The explosions tore away her entire bow section, from the stem back to turret 1. The forward 90 feet of the ship simply ceased to exist. Fuel oil ignited. Seawater rushed into the destroyed bow. The ship immediately began settling by the head. Captain Charles Rosendahl ordered counter-flooding of after compartments to keep the ship level. Minneapolis slowed to 5 knots and began maneuvering toward Tulagi Harbor for emergency repairs. New Orleans, second in the cruiser column, was hit by 1 torpedo on her port bow at 23:38 hours. The explosion was even more devastating than the hits on Minneapolis. The entire bow section, from the stem back to turret 2, was blown completely off. Over 100 feet of the ship's forward structure disappeared instantly. The bow section, weighing hundreds of tons, sank immediately. 183 men died in backseats. That forward section. They had no chance to escape. The remaining section of New Orleans wallowed dead in the water, her forward end a mass of twisted steel and exposed compartments. Pensacola was hit by 1 torpedo on her port side at 23:39 hours. The torpedo struck near the after-engine room. The explosion ruptured fuel tanks and started massive fires. Burning fuel oil spread throughout the after sections of the ship. The crew fought the fires desperately while the ship continued to maneuver. Pensacola remained under power, but was badly damaged. 125 men died in the engineering spaces and nearby compartments. Northampton, last in the cruiser column, was hit by 2 torpedoes on her port side at 23:40 hours. Both torpedoes struck amidships near the engineering spaces. The explosions were catastrophic. Boilers exploded. Fuel oil ignited. The ship's back was broken. Northampton developed an immediate list to port that grew steadily worse. Damage control teams tried desperately to control flooding and fight fires, but the damage was too severe. Captain Willard Kitts ordered abandon ship at 01:30 hours. Northampton capsized and sank at 02:50 hours on December 1st. 258 men died. In less than 4 minutes, 4 American heavy cruisers had been torpedoed. 1 was sinking. 3 were crippled and barely afloat. Over 700 American sailors were dead or would die from their wounds in the coming hours. Task Force 67 had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. The Japanese destroyers withdrew to the northwest at maximum speed. They had completed their mission. The supply drums had been dumped overboard off Tassafaronga Point before the battle started. Japanese troops would recover the supplies, and Admiral Tanaka had inflicted devastating losses on the American force with minimal cost. 2 Japanese destroyers sunk, Takanami and Kuroshio. 6 destroyers escaped with minimal damage. Admiral Wright ordered the surviving ships to withdraw toward Espiritu Santo. The 3 crippled cruisers limped south, escorted by the destroyers. Minneapolis and New Orleans eventually made it to Tulagi, then to rear area shipyards for repairs. Both ships were out of action for over a year. Pensacola reached Espiritu Santo under her own power, but required extensive repairs. The Battle of Tassafaronga was a devastating American defeat. The casualty ratio was approximately 4-1 in Japan's favor. 721 American sailors died. Approximately 400 Japanese sailors died. 4 American heavy cruisers were knocked out of action. 2 Japanese destroyers were sunk. By any measure, the Japanese had won decisively. American forces had possessed radar. They had detected the Japanese force first. They had achieved surprise with their initial torpedo attack. They had sunk 2 Japanese destroyers. But then disaster struck because doctrine failed. Admiral Wright ordered his cruisers to open fire with guns and searchlights before the torpedo threat was neutralized. The gunfire and searchlights revealed American positions. Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes at the illuminated targets and achieved devastating hits. Commander Cole had warned Wright about exactly this scenario. Launch torpedoes silently, withdraw before opening gunfire, do not illuminate targets because it reveals your position. But Wright had followed traditional doctrine. Use destroyers for initial torpedo attack, then bring in cruisers for gunfire to finish the enemy. That doctrine worked when both sides were blind in darkness. It failed catastrophically when the enemy had superior torpedoes and could see your gun flashes. The after-action analysis was brutal. Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific Forces, ordered a comprehensive investigation. The investigation concluded that American radar had provided overwhelming tactical advantage. American forces detected the Japanese first. American forces maneuvered into perfect attack position. American forces fired first. All of these advantages came from radar. But then, command decisions negated the radar advantage. Delaying the destroyer torpedo attack until 10,000 yards reduced surprise. Opening gunfire immediately after torpedoes were launched revealed American positions before the torpedo threat could be assessed. Using searchlights made American cruisers perfect targets. The tactical victory of detecting the enemy first became a strategic defeat because doctrine had not evolved to match technology. The investigation recommended fundamental changes in night combat doctrine. Destroyers must be allowed to attack independently using radar. Launch torpedoes at maximum effective range, 12 to 15,000 yards, not the traditional visual range of 8 to 10,000 yards. Do not open gunfire until torpedo results are observed. Never use searchlights in night combat against an enemy armed with long-range torpedoes. Trust radar data over visual confirmation. These recommendations became standard doctrine within weeks. Future night engagements would be fought using radar-directed torpedo attacks from extended range with minimal gunfire until the torpedo threat was neutralized. The lessons from Tassafaronga were learned quickly and applied ruthlessly. But the immediate cost was terrible. 700 American sailors died, teaching the United States Navy how to fight with radar. The technology had been available. The tactical advantage had been present. The victory had been within reach. But leadership failed to use the technology correctly. Traditional thinking about how naval battles should be fought overrode the new capabilities radar provided. USS Fletcher survived the battle undamaged. Commander Cole's frustration was documented in his personal log, though not in official reports. Cole knew his destroyers could have won the engagement decisively if they had been allowed to attack independently at longer range. He knew opening gunfire immediately had been a catastrophic mistake. He knew searchlights had painted targets for Japanese torpedoes, but Cole was a commander, not an admiral. He followed orders, even though he knew the orders were wrong. Cole continued commanding destroyer divisions through 1943 and 44. He was promoted to captain and given command of Destroyer Squadron 23, the same squadron Ali Burke had commanded. Cole applied the lessons from Tassafaronga ruthlessly. His destroyers fought using radar-directed attacks from extended range. They launched torpedoes silently. They avoided searchlights. They trusted their radar operators. Cole's destroyer squadron achieved multiple victories in 1944 with minimal losses. Admiral Wright was relieved of command within 2 weeks of Tassafaronga. He was never given another combat command. The official explanation was that he was needed for administrative duties, but everyone in the Navy understood what had happened. Wright had been given overwhelming technological advantage and failed to use it properly. His decisions had cost 700 American lives and 4 heavy cruisers. The Navy could not afford commanders who did not understand how to fight with radar. Wright's replacement was Rear Admiral Aaron Stanton Merrill, an officer who had studied radar tactics extensively. Merrill understood that radar changed everything about night combat. He immediately implemented the tactical recommendations from the Tassafaronga investigation. Destroyers would operate independently. Torpedo attacks would be launched at extended range. Gunfire would be delayed until torpedo results were confirmed. Searchlights would not be used. Merrill's first major engagement came on November 1st, 1943 at Empress Augusta Bay. His force consisted of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, all equipped with SG radar. Japanese Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori brought 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers to intercept American forces landing troops on Bougainville. Merrill detected the Japanese force on radar at 37,000 yards. He maneuvered his destroyers into attack position while keeping his cruisers back. At 23,000 yards, Merrill's destroyers launched torpedoes. The torpedoes ran for 6 minutes before hitting. Japanese destroyer Sendai was struck by 2 torpedoes and sank. Japanese destroyer Samidare was crippled by 1 torpedo hit. The Japanese force tried to close for their own torpedo attack, but Merrill's cruisers opened fire from 20,000 yards using radar-directed gunfire. The Japanese could not see American ships. American shells began hitting Japanese cruisers before Japanese lookouts spotted muzzle flashes. Heavy cruiser Miyako was hit multiple times and withdrew damaged. Light cruiser Agano was also hit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese Admiral Omori ordered withdrawal after only 20 minutes of combat. His force had taken heavy damage without inflicting any casualties on American ships. The Japanese retreated northwest, pursued by American destroyers. No American ships were hit, no American sailors died. The engagement was a complete American victory achieved through proper use of radar. The contrast with Tassafaronga could not have been more stark. At Tassafaronga, American forces detected the enemy first, achieved surprise, but then suffered devastating losses because they revealed their positions with gunfire and searchlights. At Empress Augusta Bay, American forces detected the enemy first, attacked with torpedoes from extended range, used radar-directed gunfire without searchlights, and achieved complete victory with 0 losses. The difference was not technology. Both battles involved American ships with SG radar fighting Japanese ships with no radar. The difference was doctrine. At Tassafaronga, doctrine had not caught up with technology. At Empress Augusta Bay, doctrine fully exploited what radar made possible. Similar patterns played out repeatedly in 1943 and 44. At Cape St. George on November 25, 1943, American destroyers under Captain Ali Burke detected Japanese destroyers at 22,000 yards. Burke's destroyers maneuvered into position using radar and launched torpedoes at 12,000 yards. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk. 0 American ships were hit. The engagement lasted 35 minutes. At the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, American destroyers detected Japanese battleships entering Surigao Strait at over 30,000 yards. The destroyers launched torpedo attacks from extended range while remaining invisible to Japanese lookouts. Multiple Japanese ships were torpedoed before the main battle line engagement even began. American battleships then crossed the Japanese T and destroyed the remaining Japanese ships using radar-directed gunfire. It was the last battleship engagement in history and a complete American victory achieved through radar dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried desperately to counter American radar superiority. By 1944, Japanese engineers had developed functional surface search radar comparable to early American systems, but production was limited. Only a handful of Japanese ships received radar installations before the war ended. More critically, Japanese tactical doctrine never fully adapted to radar use. Japanese commanders continued to emphasize visual spotting and optical range-finding, even when radar was available. They used radar as a supplement to lookouts, not as the primary detection system. This reflected decades of training and cultural emphasis on superior night optics. Japanese lookouts were genuinely better trained than American lookouts, but no amount of training could allow human eyes to see ships at 20,000 yards in complete darkness. Japanese destroyer captains who had dominated night combat in 1942 found themselves consistently defeated in 1943 and 44. Ships that they could not see would launch torpedoes from ranges where visual detection was impossible. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted muzzle flashes, torpedoes were already in the water approaching at 48 knots. Japanese forces tried to counter by making radical evasive maneuvers when entering combat zones, but this only disrupted their own formations without preventing radar detection. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese destroyer commanders who had spent 20 years perfecting night combat tactics found those tactics suddenly obsolete. They were being hunted by an enemy they could not see using technology they did not have. Confidence eroded. Aggressive tactics gave way to caution. By late 1944, Japanese surface forces avoided night engagements unless they had overwhelming superiority. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who commanded Japanese forces at Tassafaronga, understood what had happened better than most Japanese officers. After the war, Tanaka wrote extensively about destroyer operations. He specifically mentioned that American radar had negated Japanese advantages in night combat. He noted that Japanese tactics developed in the 1920s and 30s assumed both sides would be equally blind in darkness. When one side could see and the other could not, traditional tactics failed completely. Tanaka acknowledged that his victory at Tassafaronga was partially due to American mistakes. If American forces had used their radar properly, launching torpedoes at longer range and avoiding searchlights, the outcome would have been different. Tanaka recognized that Japanese forces won that night not because they were superior, but because American commanders had not yet learned how to fight with radar. The technology that gave American forces their advantage had a remarkable development history. The SG radar that Fletcher carried in November 1942 was based on British cavity magnetron technology shared with the United States in September 1940. British scientists brought the magnetron to America in exchange for American industrial capacity to mass-produce radar systems. The radiation laboratory at MIT received the magnetron in November 1940 and immediately began developing microwave radar systems. The SG surface search radar emerged from this work in early 1942. It operated at approximately 3,000 megahertz with a 10-centimeter wavelength. This was revolutionary compared to earlier radars that used wavelengths measured in meters. The SG's shorter wavelength provided dramatically better resolution. Earlier, SC radar operating at 200 megahertz with a 1.5-meter wavelength could detect ships, but the radar returns were fuzzy and difficult to distinguish from land masses or weather. The SG provided crisp, clear returns that showed ships as distinct points on the display. Operators could track multiple targets simultaneously, even when those targets were close to islands or in formation. The SG also featured the plan position indicator display, a circular screen showing a map-like view of the tactical situation. The display updated continuously as the antenna rotated at 15 revolutions per minute. An operator could see the entire tactical picture at a glance. Formation positions were obvious. Contact courses could be determined by watching how points moved across the screen. It was intuitive and required less training than the oscilloscope displays used by earlier radar systems. USS Fletcher received her SG radar during construction at Federal Shipbuilding in Kearny, New Jersey. She was commissioned on June 30th, 1942, one of the first Fletcher-class destroyers completed. The Fletcher class would become the most numerous destroyer class in U.S. Navy history. 175 ships were built between 1942 and 1944. Nearly all carried SG radar as standard equipment. Commander William Cole took Commander Fletcher in August 1942. He immediately began training his crew in radar operations. Cole understood that radar would determine who won night battles. He drilled his radar operators constantly, track multiple targets, calculate ranges and bearings, determine target courses and speeds from radar plots, provide targeting data to the bridge and gun directors. Cole's emphasis on radar training made Fletcher one of the most radar-proficient destroyers in the fleet by November 1942. But training individual ships was not enough. Entire task forces needed to understand how to fight with radar. The technology existed, the individual ship capabilities existed, but coordinating multiple ships using radar data required new procedures and new command structures. This was what failed at Tassafaronga. Admiral Wright had the technology, but not the doctrine to use it effectively. The Navy addressed this problem by creating Formal Combat Information Center doctrine. Before Tassafaronga, CICs were improvised spaces with no standardized procedures. After Tassafaronga, the Navy mandated that every ship have a properly organized CIC with trained personnel. The CIC would maintain complete tactical awareness for the commanding officer. Radar operators, plotters, and communicators would work together to process information from multiple sources and present it clearly to command personnel. The Navy also established formal training schools for CIC personnel. Operators learned to interpret radar returns under various conditions. Plotters learned to maintain accurate tactical plots. Communicators learned to relay information efficiently. Officers learned to command using radar data as their primary information source. The curriculum emphasized that radar was not a backup to visual systems. It was the primary sensor for night combat and increasingly for day combat as well. These changes took months to implement fully, but by mid-1943, most American warships had properly organized CICs with trained crews. The improvement in operational effectiveness was dramatic. Ships could track dozens of targets simultaneously. Task force commanders had complete situational awareness. Attacks could be coordinated across multiple ships using shared radar data. Japanese forces never achieved this level of radar integration. Even when Japanese ships received radar equipment, they lacked the organizational structures to use it effectively. Japanese CICs, when they existed, were poorly organized afterthoughts. Radar operators worked in isolation from plotting teams and command personnel. Information flow was slow and inefficient. Japanese commanders continued to rely primarily on visual reports from lookouts, supplemented occasionally by radar data. The organizational difference was as important as the technological difference. American forces treated radar as the foundation of their entire tactical system. Japanese forces treated radar as an interesting, supplementary tool. This doctrinal gap meant that even when Japanese ships had radar comparable to American systems, they could not achieve the same operational results. USS Fletcher continued operating in the South Pacific through 1943 and into 1944. She participated in numerous shore bombardments and screening operations. On February 1st, 1943, Fletcher engaged Japanese destroyers during the Battle of Rennell Island. Using radar, Fletcher detected enemy ships at over 20,000 yards and maneuvered into attack position. She launched torpedoes that damaged Japanese cruiser Kako. In November 1943, Fletcher supported the invasion of Bougainville. She provided anti-aircraft defense for landing forces and conducted shore bombardments against Japanese positions. Her SG radar proved invaluable for navigation in confined waters around the Solomon Islands. The radar could detect reefs, small islands, and navigation hazards that were invisible to lookouts in darkness or poor weather. Commander Cole was promoted to captain and transferred to other duties in January 1944. Fletcher received a new commanding officer and continued operations through the Philippines campaign. She was present at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Fletcher served as a radar picket, detecting incoming Japanese forces and vectoring American ships into position. Fletcher survived the war without major damage. She participated in operations through 1945, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Okinawa, Fletcher's primary mission was radar picket duty, detecting incoming kamikaze aircraft and directing combat air patrols to intercept. The SG surface search radar had been supplemented by additional air search radars specifically for this mission. Fletcher detected and helped intercept dozens of kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign. After the war, Fletcher was decommissioned in May 1947 and placed in reserve. She was reactivated for service during the Korean War in October 1949. Her World War II-era radar was updated with newer systems, but the basic SG radar remained installed as a backup. Fletcher served in Korean waters from 1950 through 1952, providing naval gunfire support and screening operations. Fletcher was decommissioned again in May 1952 and returned to reserve. She remained in reserve through the 1950s and 60s as the Navy decided what to do with World War II-era destroyers. By the 1960s, Fletcher was obsolete. Guided missile destroyers and modern electronics had rendered ships like Fletcher museum pieces. But Fletcher's historical significance was recognized. In 1968, the Navy authorized Fletcher's transfer to preservation as a museum ship. She was towed to Buffalo, New York, and became part of the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park. Fletcher remains there today, one of the few surviving Fletcher-class destroyers and the only one preserved with her World War II configuration substantially intact. Visitors to Fletcher can tour her bridge, combat information center, engine rooms and crew spaces, the CIC where radar operators tracked Japanese ships at Tassafaronga is preserved. The SG radar antenna mount is still visible on the forward mast, though the actual radar equipment has deteriorated. The torpedo mounts that launched Mark 15 torpedoes in November 1942 are still in place. The ship serves as a memorial to the 25 Fletcher-class destroyers lost during World War II and the thousands of sailors who served aboard them. 19 Fletcher-class destroyers were sunk by enemy action. 6 more were lost to accidents or weather. Over 2,000 American sailors died serving aboard Fletcher-class destroyers during the war. Commander William Cole continued his naval career after leaving Fletcher's. He commanded destroyer squadrons through 1944 and 45. His emphasis on radar tactics and aggressive independent operations became a standard doctrine for American destroyer forces. Cole was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1950 and served in various shore assignments during the Korean War. He retired in 1956 as a Vice Admiral. Cole died in 1978 at age 76. Admiral Carlton Wright never received another combat command after Tassafaronga. He served in administrative positions for the remainder of the war. Wright retired from the Navy in 1946 as a Rear Admiral. He never publicly discussed Tassafaronga in detail, though he acknowledged in private correspondence that his decisions that night had been wrong. Wright died in 1973 at age 82. Admiral Raizo Tanaka continued commanding Japanese destroyer forces through 1943. He fought in multiple engagements and consistently demonstrated tactical brilliance. But even Tanaka could not overcome American radar superiority. His forces were gradually worn down through attrition. Tanaka was relieved of destroyer command in December 1943 and assigned to shore duties in Burma. He survived the war and wrote extensively about destroyer operations. His memoirs remain important historical sources on Japanese naval tactics. Tanaka died in 1969 at age 77. The Battle of Tassafaronga remains one of the most instructive engagements of the Pacific War. It demonstrated that technology alone does not win battles. American forces had overwhelming technological advantage through radar. They detected the enemy first. They achieved surprise. They struck first. But they still lost because doctrine failed to match technology. The lesson was learned quickly. Within weeks, American naval doctrine was rewritten to fully exploit radar capabilities. Destroyers gained authority to operate independently. Torpedo attacks were launched at extended range. Gunfire was delayed until torpedo threats were neutralized. Searchlights were abandoned entirely in night combat. Trust in radar became absolute. These doctrinal changes, implemented in response to the Tassafaronga disaster, gave American forces overwhelming superiority in night combat for the remainder of the war. Japanese forces, despite their superior training and excellent torpedoes, could not compete with an enemy who could see them while remaining invisible. The tactical balance that had favored Japan for the first year of the war shifted permanently to American favor. The 700 American sailors who died at Tassafaronga paid the price for this lesson. Their sacrifice taught the United States Navy how to fight with radar. The cruisers they died aboard, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton, became symbols of what happens when doctrine lags behind technology. The investigation that followed Tassafaronga produced recommendations that saved thousands of lives in subsequent engagements. Modern naval warfare remains dependent on sensors and information systems. Today's warships carry radar systems far more sophisticated than the SG radar Fletcher used in 1942. Modern naval radar can track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 200 miles. Phased array systems provide instant three-dimensional coverage. Computer systems process radar data and provide automated threat assessments. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. The side that sees first and acts decisively usually wins. Technology provides the capability to see. Doctrine determines how that capability is used. Training ensures personnel can exploit the technology effectively. Leadership decides whether to trust new capabilities or cling to familiar methods. The Battle of Tassafaronga demonstrated all of these principles. American forces had the technology. Fletcher's radar detected Japanese ships at 23,000 yards. The capability existed to win decisively with minimal losses, but leadership failed to trust the technology fully. Admiral Wright delayed the torpedo attack and ordered gunfire that revealed American positions. The result was catastrophic. 11 months later, at Empress Augusta Bay, American forces had the same technology, but better doctrine. Admiral Merrill trusted his radar completely. He attacked from extended range. He avoided revealing his positions unnecessarily. The result was complete victory with 0 American losses. Same technology, different doctrine, completely different outcome. This pattern appears throughout military history. New technology creates potential advantages, but realizing those advantages requires new thinking about how to fight. Organizations that adapt quickly gain decisive superiority. Organizations that cling to traditional methods lose battles they should have won. The United States Navy adapted quickly after Tassafaronga. Within months, radar-centered doctrine was standard throughout the fleet. Commanders who understood radar received priority for combat assignments. Training emphasized radar operations. Ship designs incorporated radar from the beginning rather than adding it as an afterthought. The Navy transformed itself from an organization that had radar to an organization built around radar. The Imperial Japanese Navy never completed this transformation. Japanese ships received radar equipment, but Japanese doctrine never fully embraced radar as the primary sensor. Japanese commanders continued to emphasize visual spotting even when radar was available. This doctrinal conservatism meant Japanese forces fought at a permanent disadvantage from mid-1943 onward. The human cost of this failure was enormous. Thousands of Japanese sailors died in battles where they never saw the enemy. Japanese destroyers and cruisers were destroyed by ships their lookouts could not spot. Japanese battleships were torpedoed by submarines they could not detect. Japanese carriers were located and destroyed by aircraft guided by radar. The technological gap created a slaughter. Some historians argue that radar was the most important technology of the Pacific War, more significant than aircraft carriers or submarines or atomic weapons. Aircraft carriers provided mobility and striking power. Submarines cut Japanese supply lines. Atomic weapons ended the war quickly. But radar determined who won naval battles, and naval battles determined who controlled the Pacific. The argument has merit. American forces won nearly every major naval engagement from mid-1943 onward, primarily because they could detect enemy forces first and act on that information effectively. Japanese forces, despite excellent ships and superbly trained crews, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting blind against an enemy who could see. USS Fletcher played a small but significant role in this transformation. Her radar detected Japanese ships at Tassafaronga. Her crew was ready to execute the tactics that would have won decisively. Commander Cole understood what needed to be done, but organizational hierarchy prevented execution. Admiral Wright's decisions negated Fletcher's capabilities. The battle was lost, not because American technology failed, but because American leadership failed to use that technology properly. The lesson remains relevant. Technology creates possibilities. Leadership determines whether those possibilities become reality. Organizations succeed when leadership understands new capabilities and adapts doctrine to exploit them. Organizations fail when leadership clings to traditional methods despite overwhelming evidence that those methods no longer work. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.